So, Dorian, so I also biked across the country when I was much younger. But unlike you, this was earlier. I had a camera, and I would stop my bike in the middle of the road, and I would take a picture of the road in front of me, thinking, "This is so awesome. This is so amazing, so wonderful." And I did that all the way across the country. I get back, when I downloaded the pictures that I looked at them, it was all the same picture of me sitting on a bike, just looking at the road in front of me. That's all I had. So, but to me, it was quite wonderful. I also have to say, I am my oldest son, Josh, works with Vanessa, and your talk brought tears to my eyes. He is so blessed to work with you. I'm so thrilled for what you all are doing. So thank you so much for that talk. Thank you so much for what you're doing. You're going to change the world. Girl Trick is going to change the world. So I'm going to say that. So imagine if you had a blank check. Somebody handed you a blank check. No rules, no roadmap. You have no idea what it's for. You have no idea how much money you have. What would you do? What would you do? So that's the question I posed to you, but it's also the question that I posed in this book. This book had been bombing around in my head for years. This is my 30th book. I've written lots of books for kids, for adults. This novel, though, was stuck in my brain for years. And it starts with a simple question. What if somebody gave you an unlimited amount of money and you had no idea what to do with it or how to go about doing something with it? What would you do? Well, that's what this is about. There's a Washington Post reporter, and he makes his way inside the Billionaires Club. And I'll just say this: it is a very interesting club. So I won't spoil the plot, but I'll just say that this reporter makes his way inside of that club and finds what it's like to be inside of that club. Over the years, and as Letha and I talked about this, I've had the joy and the pleasure to work with dozens of billionaires. I've raised money from billionaires. I've worked with them. I've helped them build things. And a handful of them also helped me start a climate communications nonprofit. I've been inside and outside of government. I'm currently in a big job in Washington here. But so I've gotten to know billionaires, and they're a very unique group, and it's a very unique club. So as you just heard, there are 2,700 or so billionaires. They make $2.7 billion a day, while the lowest 90% earn just $1 a day. Just 81 billionaires have more wealth than 50% of the world. And the last fact I want to leave with you before I start telling stories about some of those billionaires is that there are 735 billionaires in the United States who are wealthier than the bottom 50% of households in America. So the stark truth is that we're living in the greatest era of wealth inequity since World War II. And I think it might potentially be one of our greatest challenges. But to lighten this talk up for a little bit, I also I want to tell some stories, and I'll say very quickly. I've told stories all my life. My kids always say, "Dad, we've heard that story 100 times," and I always say, "Well, I'm sorry, you're going to hear it 101." So I happen to be a storyteller at heart. So what you're looking at here is Billionaires Row, and it's where the billionaires live, work, and play. And so story number one, and I'm going to try to make this as interactive as I possibly can. This is an image from the 40th floor of one of those apartments that looks out over Central Park. And when I first started to try to raise money for one of my nonprofits, I went and met with not one but two billionaires. The first billionaire sat in that chair, looked out over he sat with his back to the window and made me stare out at that iconic scene. The second billionaire took a seat to the right, and the two of them engaged in a conversation with me as a bystander about whether climate change was worth funding and whether it was worth talking about climate change. So for 3 hours, I was mesmerized by this picture that you see up on the screen there while they sat with their backs to that window. And that's kind of the mindset of a typical billionaire. They've seen this image a million times from private jets or from their penthouses. They no longer actually have to stare at that window. But for me, sitting there trying to raise money from them, I was awestruck, which I think was kind of the point. So I'm going to try to make this a guessing game. Billionaire number one on the left, eventually, he did give money to the nonprofit that I had started. He's one of the most well-known billionaires in the world. He is both vilified and endeared by, depending upon who you talk about, and he made his first billions by betting against the pound sterling. He's probably given away more of his wealth percentage-wise than any philanthropist in history. So that's billionaire number one. Billionaire number two is the OG of hedge funds. And he spawned a whole number of other hedge fund managers known as tiger cubs. And so he was billionaire number two. So my question is, who knows who either of these are? Either the man who made his billions betting against the pound sterling or the tiger cubs. So George Soros, anybody else? Who thinks George Soros? Anybody have a guess on who the second billionaire is? The original, really the OG of hedge funds. Second billionaire was Julian Robertson. And yes, George Soros was the first one. And I have to say, I was so mesmerized by that conversation because, again, looking out through that window, he's taken television crews up there to sort of film from there. It's basically surreal when you actually have to see that. So story number two, from Billionaires Row. I had worked with a very large aerospace company to help build one of the first IPTV networks from scratch. Involved all sorts of very interesting things like shrinking data to quantum packets. And when it came time to try to sell that, I went to New York and I met at the Four Seasons restaurant, this is actually a picture from Four Seasons, which is now gone. But he had cleared out the entire restaurant. There was just one table in the middle of one of the most iconic restaurants in the world. It cleared out the entire room and just left one round table sitting in the middle. And he had brought in a local anchor from Fox News to have a discussion. And we sat there for 3 hours in the middle of the Four Seasons talking about whether he was going to give $75 million and acquire this IPTV network. And at the end, after all this discussion, I leaned over and I said, okay, are you going to give us the $75 million for it and take a minority interest in this network? And he leaned over and he goes, if I'm giving you $75 million, I will own everything. And that is actually the mindset that you tend to see. Billionaires have a very distinct mindset, which is big ideas, and they really genuinely feel like they can change the world. So some clues about this billionaire. A little bit more difficult, so I'll give you 3 clues. He owned the Seattle Seahawks, tried to move it to Los Angeles. That didn't work. His foundation gave away more than 1 million wheelchairs to folks in Africa. And here in Washington, the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, the Mammal Hall is named after him because he was a big game hunter. So any guesses on who this might be? Paul Allen, pretty good guess there, but he was the owner prior to Paul Allen. So who owned the Seattle Seahawks prior to Paul Allen? Anybody? So if you go to the Smithsonian, you'll see it's called the Ken Behring Hall. It's the Mammal Hall, and he named it after that. So I will say I was not successful in convincing him to buy that network. So number 3, again, this is an aerial shot of Billionaires Row. So I wanted to convince yet another billionaire who came from a Brazilian and Middle Eastern banking family to start a television network. And I went to visit him in his building. His family owns several buildings. Some of them are on the east side, as you can see from there. Some of them are in central Manhattan. And when I came to the building, I walked into the building and I said, I'm here to meet this person. Can you tell me what suite or room? And he goes, oh, there's no suite. Just go to the top of the building. And this is a very big building in the center of Manhattan. I said, what do you mean go to the top of the building? He says, go up and go where there aren't any more numbers. Just go above the last number. And I said, that sounds like something from a movie. And he said, well, that's where he is. So I punched an unnamed, a button that had no number on it, and I went to the top of the building. And I get off the top, and there's nothing in the hallway. It's sort of a bleak, dimly lit hall with a door at the end and no number on it. And I walk down the hall, knock on the door, and he answers the door. And I walk through, we go out to the veranda, and we spend the afternoon looking out over what you see here, but from a slightly lower level, and talked about the television network that he really wanted. So I'm going to give you 3 clues for this one as well. He financed 8 of Woody Allen's movies. Small Time Crooks was his the eighth and final one. Woody Allen actually took him to court in New York and argued over the back-end proceeds. He also purchased Encyclopedia Britannica, and I believe he's still the chairman. He's been the chairman of Encyclopedia Britannica for 27 years. And he just this year sold the most near complete Hebrew Bible for $38 million. So any thoughts on who this might be? Anybody believe that that's Jackie Safra I just described? Anyone else? Yes, you're correct. It's Jackie Safra. And I will say it's one of the, and I'm going to double back on this in just a second. He always used a pseudonym, J.E. Beaucaire, in those movies, in the Woody Allen movies. So when you watch some of those Woody Allen movies, and Beaucaire, it was sort of an inside joke, was the barber to King Louis XV, and that's why he took that name. So next, for the second round, I'm going to talk about Hollywood. And Hollywood's now a slightly different place. It really is the land of billionaires. They finance all of the big tentpole movies, and the directors and actors who aspire to make the Forbes 400 list, which is sort of the definitive list that everybody aspires to be on. So Hollywood is really now billionaire adjacent. There are billionaires who are there, but they also tend to finance these movies. So the first one I want to talk about, and when I have told this story to my kids, they actually don't believe it, but he was the first to be on the first Hollywood celebrity to be on the Forbes 400 list. He had a very famous Pro-Am celebrity tournament that invited presidents. Here you see Presidents Bush, Clinton, and Ford, who came and played in it. And I got a call one day. I was working for the vice president at the time. I was his communications director, and he calls up and he says, "I want your guy to play at my celebrity Pro-Am." And for the next hour, I was an audience of one, as maybe the most well-known comedian in history, told me joke after joke after joke. So for a full hour, I was his audience of one, and he went through his entire set for an hour just to convince my boss to play in the celebrity Pro-Am. So at the end of that hour, and the people inside of the office didn't understand why I was laughing, hysterically for a full hour. He also remade, I talked to you about J.E. Beaucaire, he remade that movie, the silent film that had Rudolph Valentino in the 1920s. He made it into a comedy in the 1940s. He also was quite famous for USO tours with Marilyn Monroe that you see there. He made a bunch of movies with Bing Crosby, and he was the most prominent guest in the history of the Johnny Carson show. So who is this entertainer? There you go. Yes, Bob Hope. By the way, it came out much later in books. Johnny Carson hated having Bob Hope on his show. So, second story, and you might be able to tell who this is just from the pictures here, but I had, and this, he was not quite a billionaire when I first met him, but based on his latest $1 billion plus movie, I'm pretty sure he is now. The then executive director of the Sierra Club and I had a chance to spend nearly 4 hours with him in his hotel room, and by the end, we were both exhausted because he asked us probably 500 questions about climate change. He was relentless. He got to the bottom of every single question that he wanted answered around climate change. And we weren't necessarily asking him for money, although I always use opportunities like that to raise money, and I did. But what I was really impressed about him was that he really, truly wanted to understand climate change because he wanted to put that knowledge to work in movies that he was making, which he did in this most recent one that's around oceans. So and here are a couple of clues. And he went to the bottom of the ocean, the Mariana Trench, in a one-man submersible. He was the executive producer on The Years of Living Dangerously, which I've helped with. They won an Emmy when it was on Showtime. And his movies tend to make billions of dollars. So who can guess who this is? You've got it. Number three is, again, you might be able to tell what's going on here. But the story I wanted to tell about this person was billionaires flock to his movies. They love his movies in Hollywood. They are almost always universally successful. He's maybe the most successful child actor, producer, writer, and now director in Hollywood history, maybe other than James Cameron. But when I met him, I had asked him to be the keynote speaker at the AAAS convention. AAAS, for those of you who don't know, is the largest convening of scientists in the world. They tend to get thousands and thousands of scientists. And I had asked him to be the keynote presenter. So when I went to the green room, and it was just the two of us in the back, I found him sitting in the back of the green room, and he had almost sweated through his shirt. He was profoundly nervous. Again, this is somebody who makes the biggest movies in the world, the most successful that you could possibly imagine in Hollywood. And I asked him, I sat with him, and we sat and talked quietly in the green room. I said, what's going on? He goes, these are scientists. I'm speaking to thousands of scientists. They're so much smarter than I am. And I looked at him and I said, you've got to be kidding me. You're maybe the greatest storyteller we have living today. They just want to hear you tell stories. And what's more, you honor their science in your movies, in Apollo 13, in some of the movies that he's made. But I have to say, I was honestly quite stunned that he was nervous speaking to a room full of scientists. That I said, just go out there and tell stories. And he did, and quite naturally, he blew the doors off in his speech because, but the juxtaposition between the greatest storyteller maybe we have alive today versus, trying to speak to a room full of scientists was kind of mind-boggling. And then I'm going to try to wrap up quickly here with a few final stories. Then there are billionaires, and I've met and raised money from quite a number of them who they feel like it's their job to fundamentally remake the world. Sometimes in their own image, sometimes based on the strength of big ideas that they've assimilated or heard about, and they truly view themselves as world changers and game changers. And I'm just going to name check a few of these. I had a chance to sit with David Koch, whose brother is Charles Koch, and hear him describe how he wanted to merge his political network with the tobacco industry, and I have a history with that I can talk about at another time. And to create a series of anti-tax groups in the United States that are designed to break down the federal government in the United States and in Washington, and to shrink the size of the federal government. And I've written about that in a book called Poison Tea. I have spoken about that to lots of folks behind closed doors about what all of this is going on. I've written in Time Magazine about this. But David Koch was the kind of a billionaire who really wanted to use his wealth and power to fundamentally remake the U.S. political system. And I would argue he did. I also, Elon Musk and I have exchanged emails, and in a rather uncomfortable set of exchanged emails, somebody had asked me to advise him when he had publicly disparaged somebody and said some pretty horrible things about this person. And it all came out in trial, and our email exchanges came out in trial. And in it, I had written back to him and said, if you don't stop saying horrible things about this person in public, your board is probably going to let you go. And he wrote back and he said, basically, yes, you're right. And the quote was, I am an effing idiot. And that made the newspapers all over the world in the middle of that court case. And I also I spent 2 days at Tom Steyer's ranch, where a couple of dozen of us spent the day talking about everything you can possibly imagine related to climate change. And from that was born the notion that when then President Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, that several of us in our organizations would actually try to keep the United States in the Paris Climate Agreement. But I have one final story that I want to talk about and then close. And I want to talk about Mark Andreessen. And I don't know Mark Andreessen. I've never met him. Hope to someday. But I know the guy who made him a billionaire. And this is a somewhat unusual story. Eric Bina is the guy on the left. He's the guy who actually wrote the code for the original Mosaic browser. And it was just a little tiny NSF grant, $75,000, the supplemental grant to the supercomputer system at the University of Illinois. And in a 2-day period, Eric told me in one of the few interviews he's ever done about the origins of the Mosaic browser, which became the source code for both Navigator and Internet Explorer, he dynamically, it was a very simple code. He just created a way to pull pictures from one set of files and merge them into text for another, so that it would appear in a public-facing browser together. Now that sounds fairly simple, but at the time it was revolutionary in that it made the internet, browsers of the day, accessible to the public. And that's why Mosaic was so successful. But Mark Anderson was the marketing guy. It was his name that was on all the Mosaic releases that went out over the world, and which led him to become a billionaire. And recently, he issued something called the Techno Optimist Manifesto. And I'm sure you've probably heard about this, or most in the room have heard about this. And in it, he writes that AI, and we heard an earlier discussion about AI, that AI is going to save countless lives, millions of lives, and that he, Mark Anderson, one of the 2,700 and change billionaires, said, if anyone tries to slow down AI, they are literally killing people. And that's what's in this manifesto, and has generated quite a bit of controversy, but also praise for, so the construct is, please don't regulate AI. Don't stop it in its tracks. Let it run its course, and it will save all of us. And Sam Altman, likewise, in his own manifesto, has talked about how AI, in the not too distant future, will take care of everyone in the world. Food, housing, medicine, healthcare, climate change. It will solve some of the most complex, intractable problems in the world. And what it looks like, quite honestly, is that a super intelligent, godlike AI network or entity of some sort will, in fact, solve those complex problems. And honestly, I have to say that Anderson may be right. Sam Altman may be right. Vladimir Putin, as you saw, he feels that whoever masters AI in this first will become the ruler of the world. They may be right, but the question to me is this what the other 8 billion people on the planet actually want? So I want to close with this. This book. It's called the Billionaires Club, but there is an actual Billionaires Club, and they all tend to talk to each other. But there's some glaring gaps in that Billionaires Club. First, there are very few women in that club, especially at the upper rungs of that club. And it's actually one of the subplots of this novel that I've written. It's also a very exclusive club in that it's virtually impossible to get into it. And most of the people who actually get into it arrive there by inheriting their wealth. But I will also say that those in that club do believe, and they may in fact be right, that they drive and engineer the global economy, and that is their intent. So I will close with this, that at the top of that food chain right now is artificial intelligence. And so my question for you as I end, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Or is it perhaps just inevitable? So thanks very much.